Heading into 2019, it was very clear, I think, to everyone that the Pittsburgh Steelers were sending a very big message that it was Big Ben's team. Big Ben runs the show. That's why they ultimately didn't capitulate in the Le'Veon Bell contract negotiations. They were willing to let him sit out all of 2018 and see him walk in free agency to go to the Jets. That's why they were willing to go ahead and trade away Antonio Brown and said, you know what, it's not worth it anymore. It was a very clear statement as to who was the guy the organization wanted to, tie their future to or their present to. It was very clear who was the guy that they were putting their faith in. It was very clear who was the guy that they valued the most. And I don't think that surprises anyone. And, realistically, it's one of these things that, Le'Veon Bell has some quirks about him that I don't think are particularly appealing. Obviously, Antonio Brown certainly does. And you saw what happened once he got the heck away from Pittsburgh, like a walking nightmare. Big Ben also has his quirks and some really bad baggage in his past, too. But at the end of the day, if you're going to tie your future to any of them, it was the guy that's actually won two Super Bowls, and led the team to two Super Bowls. It's the guy that's the franchise quarterback. It's the guy that at his peak was a borderline elite quarterback. It's a guy that's going into the Pro Football Hall of Fame, probably on the first ballot. You're at this stage and point in time after almost a decade and a half, like you pretty much have to ride out the string with Big Ben as long as he wants to play if you're the Pittsburgh Steelers. So it's not surprising that heading into 2019 that they went in and they made the moves that they did and the decisions that they did. And ultimately, admittedly, I thought this might be a little bit of addition by subtraction. That the team, by clearing out some of that locker room cancer and some of that headache and some of that distraction, might actually play better. It doesn't always seem right, but it's not just about talent that helps teams win games, especially in a sport like football. But all that kind of went to pass very early on in the season when Big Ben went down with the elbow injury and ultimately was knocked out for the year. So now you have no Le'Veon Bell, no Antonio Brown, and also no Big Ben. And it was just a mess from there. It really was. Like once that happened, the season was effectively over, even though this team did a really good job of staying competitive. And let's admit it, they ranked in front five with 3 weeks left to go in the year. One of the big things that happened during the season after Big Ben's injury was a really surprising trade to go out and get Minka Fitzpatrick from the Miami Dolphins. And look, I said at the time, I didn't like the trade. I didn't understand the trade. From the context of 2019 and what happened in 2019 and looking at the future of the Pittsburgh Steelers organization, I can certainly make that argument. Now, as you go into 2020, it can change a little bit, and it's more about big picture. Now you've got a guy like Fitzpatrick who came in and played lights out for the Steelers. It was everything you could hope for, trading away a first-round pick to get the guy. Now, if Big Ben comes back and he's close to previous levels of production and play, you don't bat an eye at that trade. You just don't. So it's one of those things like short term, you traded for a safety, still missed the playoffs. Like, how much bang did you really get out of it? 2020 comes along, though, could potentially be a different story. And the ironic thing to me with all of this is I've certainly been, noteworthy for my calls for Mike Tomlin to be fired and lose his job over the past couple of years. And let's be clear, there have been plenty of reasons to do so. And there's enough there in his body of work to say this team should have another Lombardi trophy or two, or at least another Super Bowl appearance or two. And the reason they don't is in large part because of Mike Tomlin. But how ironic is it in the year where he no longer has to deal with Le'Veon Bell or Antonio Brown and he has Big Ben go down? You could easily make the argument that, this was by far his best pure coaching job. And it was. When you're going out there trotting out there Mason Rudolph and a guy named Duck Hodges, like, what the hell do you expect to happen? And yet, you look at it, the Steelers were in the mix for the playoff race with a few weeks to go. They were finding ways to win. Wasn't always pretty, but they were finding ways to get the job done. Unfortunately, reality ultimately set in, and they missed the playoffs. So looking at this offseason, the biggest news story, obviously, is going to be Big Ben. He's rehabbed from the elbow injury. He's back. That's the single biggest thing that could happen to the Steelers organization because they clearly don't have the quarterback of the future on the roster. They don't have somebody that can take over for him. They have to have Big Ben, and that's just the way it is. It's probably the way Big Ben loves it. They signed Eric Ebron trying to get themselves a little bit more playmaking ability at the tight end position. Or while they had Ramon Foster retired, their offensive line is still relatively solid and intact. You had Javon Hargrave depart via free agency, but you've got Stephon Tuitt returns from his injury. So you got some notable returns from injury for some key players in some key places. You look at the draft, you didn't have the first round pick because of the Minka Fitzpatrick trade, so it makes that 2020 first rounder look pretty successful at this point. And at least you can make the argument for the Steelers. Looking back at it now, you could say, well, they already have their quarterback at the now, so it made sense to go get the young talent on defense and risk giving up the first round pick. I spent a second round pick on Chase Claypool, the big wide receiver from Notre Dame. We'll see if he sticks wide receiver, tight end long term in the league, probably wide receiver. But this is a team right here when you talk about drafting positions such as wide receiver. I give them kind of the benefit of the doubt because they have earned it. Their track record shows they know what they're doing there. Alex Highsmith, the edge rusher they got in round 3, if he could contribute anything in a rotation along with TJ Watt and Bud Dupree, got to feel pretty good about that if you're a Steelers fan in terms of that defense and the ability to consistently get after the opposing quarterback. I think if you're a Steelers fan, you have quite a number of reasons for optimism. First is the return of Big Ben. This was arguably a playoff team last year with a total dumpster fire at the quarterback position. Now you have a guy coming back from an injury, got to rest the rest of his body a little bit, going to be a little hungry, out to prove some people wrong, show what he can still do. You've got Big Ben potentially in a really good spot, maybe having some patterns or designs on trying to win himself an MVP award, something like that. The bottom line is you got Big Ben back in the fold. Instantly, you feel like that if you're a Steelers fan, that's got to make you a playoff team. You've got a really great pass rush with TJ Watt and Bud Dupree, especially with Watt, a defensive player of the year type of guy. He's an absolute stud. Bud Dupree finally kind of figuring it out and filling out as a player and coming into his own. And then most importantly of all, you look at the Steelers for years, one of the big gripes, and certainly a gripe that I had with them, was they couldn't get the secondary right. They couldn't get it right, especially at corner. But slowly but surely, they've done a good job there. Brought in Joe Hayden, traded for Minka Fitzpatrick, Steven Nelson. They brought in, they've gotten a lot better in the secondary. They're not great, but they certainly are a lot more credible and a lot more real back there than they have been in years past. And I think that makes a vast amount of difference. So you can sit there and make the argument for an 8-win team over the 8-win team last year, hey, Big Ben coming back probably gets them 2 to 3 more wins, and that's pretty much it. And that could absolutely be true. If I was looking at reasons for concern, I'd say the running game. Is James Conner going to be able to be the bell cow back for 16 games? What are you going to do to get balance in that offense? Looking at the young receiving core, Juju did not have a good year last year. Certainly not. He was in a number 1 wide receiver position when he may be more of a number 2. But more importantly, he also had to deal with the chaos at the quarterback position. So what's he going to look like? What are the other young receivers going to look like? Is James Washington going to step up? Is Chase Claypool going to be able to contribute immediately? You look at some of these guys and you say, based off the Steelers' track record, you have some faith, a level of faith and belief that somebody is going to step up and establish themselves. But it is a serious question. Certainly helps that they have a future Hall of Fame quarterback throwing them the football, make no mistake about it, but still a question. Guys got to be able to get open, and guys got to be able to make plays. And now that Big Ben is back, it's a little more like business as usual. I always bring up one of the big concerns with the Steelers, and that's the ability to handle their business against bad teams, and in particular, bad teams on the road. If you look at last season, you want to boil it down to why they didn't make the playoffs. They lost to the Browns and the Jets. Takes you from an 8-win team to a 10-win team if you beat both of those jokers. That's really what it comes down to. And you see this time after time, year after year, under Big Ben quarterbacked and Mike Tomlin coached teams, is these losses to these really bad teams that they can't afford to have when they're either trying to contend for playoff position or contend for positioning within the playoff race. If the Steelers could do better about handling their business against the bad teams, with a returning Big Ben, a really good defense, if they get somebody to step up in the offense, you could be potentially talking about some type of dark horse Super Bowl contender here. Now, to me, when I look at this division right now, I'm sorry, I'm not jumping on the Browns bandwagon. They're the skid marks to me until proven otherwise. I think it's a 2-horse race here between Pittsburgh and Baltimore. and maybe a lot of other people do too. I can certainly see the Steelers winning the AFC North. I think they've got a lot of horses in a lot of the right places. They've got their big time quarterback back in the fold. I think last year they figured something out in terms of Mike Tomlin as a coach. I'm not quite sure they're quite as good as Baltimore, but that may not matter. Like, I still think the Steelers are probably an 11-win team this year. Like, that to me just comes out of the fact that they're going to be much better at the quarterback position. I don't know if you really see, but they got worse on defense. And getting that quarterback back is going to help them on the offensive side of the ball. If you're a Steelers fan right now, sure, you might want to beat the Ravens once or twice in the regular season, win that division. But even if you don't, it doesn't mean that you can't do big things come playoff time. We said that a lot about Steelers teams in the past, but maybe this year will be different. I think they're an 11-win team, finishing second in that division, certainly making it as a wild card team. And once they get into the playoffs, if they get the key players there to the playoffs healthy, this might be a dangerous team come January.